Hey there and welcome. In this video, I'm going to be talking about closures in JavaScript. I'm going to start by talking about closures as a concept, why they're so important, and how they're used. And then we're going to dive into some concrete examples with code. Let's jump right in. All right, so what is a closure? A closure is a function bundled together with references to its surrounding state, which is also called its lexical environment. So a closure allows an inner function to remember the variables it had access to from its surrounding state, in other words, outer functions, when the inner function was created, even if the inner function is called in a different environment. And in JavaScript, closures are created every time a function is created at function creation time. So why are closures so important to understand? Well, first, they allow you to write more efficient encapsulated code. Not fully understanding closures can lead to unexpected behavior, and of course you might be asked about closures on interviews. So how are closures used? There are many ways, but some common examples are to associate data from the lexical environment with a function that operates on that data. And this allows you to reuse functions with different inputs. And we're going to see an example of that in just a minute. Closures also allow you to create private variables and functions that are not accessible from outside the closure. So this is useful for creating encapsulated code that can't be modified or accessed by other parts of your program. And we're also going to see an example of this as well. All right, so let's jump right into the code. All right, so let's start with a simple example. Here we create a function called makeFunction, and we create a local variable called name and assign it to the string Ada Lovelace. Then we create another function called introduceSelf, which logs hello, my name is, plus the value of the name variable. And then makeFunction returns the introduceSelf function. So in line 11, we create a variable called myFunction, and we assign it to the return value of invoking makeFunction, which again returns introduceSelf. Now, what's interesting here is in some other programming languages, once a function finishes executing, local variables are no longer accessible. So what that means is once makeFunction finishes running, this name variable would actually no longer be available. So that when you call myFunction on line 13, this wouldn't actually still have access to this value, Ada Lovelace. But because we have closures in JavaScript, what's actually happening is when this function is created, this introduceSelf function is created, it actually retains a reference to the name variable and the value Ada Lovelace, so that when you call myFunction down here, it will actually print, hello, my name is Ada Lovelace, just like you would hope. So I'm going to show you that in a minute in my dev tools, and I also just want to point out I've added a console.dir statement so that we can actually see the closure directly. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to switch over to Chrome, and then I've got a snippet here. I'm going to paste the function here into snippets, and then I'm going to hit Command-Enter to run it. So you can see the string prints just like you'd expect, hello, my name is Ada Lovelace. And if we expand these properties, expand scopes, we see that there's a closure property here. And if we expand that, we can see that the closure retains a reference to the name Ada Lovelace. All right, now let's take a look at a slightly more interesting example that shows how functions can be reused with closures. Here we create a function called makeAdder, which has one parameter called addBy. And makeAdder returns an anonymous function, which itself has one parameter called num, and returns the sum of num plus addBy. On line 9, we create a variable called add5 and assign it to the return value of calling makeAdder with 5 as an argument. So when makeAdder is called, it is creating this anonymous function. And when this anonymous function is created, it is creating a closure, and it's retaining a reference to the addBy value that was present at the time this function was created. So in this case, addBy is assigned to 5. And so this add5 function, whenever it's called, it's always going to have addBy be equal to 5, and then the num is going to be whatever value is passed into that function. So here, when we call add5 and pass in 2 as an argument, it's going to add 2 to 5. And then similarly, we can create another variable called add10 and then assign it to the return value of calling make adder with 10. And then once again, it's going to create a brand new function with a brand new closure, this time remembering that add by is assigned to 10. So that when we call add 10 and pass in 2 as the argument, it's going to add 10 plus 2. Now let's just make sure that this works correctly. We're going to copy this and go over to the snippets. I'm going to paste it, and then I'm going to hit Command Enter. And then you can see, just like we expect, add 5 with 2 is 7, and add 10 with 2 is 12. All right, now let's take a look at one final example which shows how we can encapsulate private variables and functions with closures. So here we create a function called counter, and we create a local variable called count. And then we create a function called increment, which increments count by 1 each time it's called, and then it console.logs the value of count. And we return an object which has a property called increment, and we assign that to the increment function. Now, on line 17, we create a new variable called myCounter, and we assign it to the invocation of counter. So what is myCounter? MyCounter is going to be this object, and it's going to have this increment method on it. So when we call myCounter.increment, we're going to see that this logs 1, and then when we increment it again, we see that it logs 2. So what's happening here is we can actually view this count variable from outside the function, and we can increment it using this increment method. But we can't actually access or change this count variable directly. And similarly, we can use this increment function as it was provided to us within this return object, but we can't actually modify this increment function directly. So this is an example of how we can encapsulate variables and functions with closures. And I'm going to just run this in DevTools just so we can see it. And we see that it logs 1 and 2 as we expected. All right, I hope you enjoyed this overview of closures in JavaScript. If you found this video helpful, then please be sure to hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.